Hello, welcome to my talk, Brighten Up the Agile Sky and Inside View of TA453's Cyber Operations and Support to the IRGC. Excited to have you here, and apologies for not being able to be there in person. Let's go ahead and get started. Who is TA453? They are a persistent targeted Iranian aligned cyber threat, also known as Phosphorus, CharmingKitten, IPG018, APT42. They target academics, think tanks, different government agencies, as more as we'll talk about. Typically, they'll target individuals in the Middle East, US, and some Europe targeting as well. We attribute them to Iran, specifically the IRGC-IO, which we'll talk about why we believe that. So we just talked a little bit about who CharmingKitten is. We'll talk about who I am. We'll talk about the different TA453 teams. We'll talk about the infrastructure, some ways to track it, as well as the holistic support that they provide to the IRGC. And then we'll talk a little bit at a meta level about attribution and clustering of this activity and why it is can be a case study for why each individual vendor should have their own name. A little bit about myself. My name is Joshua Miller. I'm a senior threat researcher focusing on state-aligned threats from the Middle East and North Africa. I work for Proofpoint, which is an email security company. I'm also a captain in the Army Reserve and just started as an adjunct professor. Previously, I've been working with Blue Cross Blue Shield and FBI Chicago. I'm not on Twitter anymore. You can reach me on Keybase, sometimes on Mastodon. Big fan of Lemonade, and I believe that it's good to get the most controversial opinions out there early. So I think avocados are disgusting and coffee is overrated. Because this is a virtual talk, I will not be offended if you get up and leave. I won't even know that you're leaving. So please feel free to leave if that offends you. So let's start with the many sides of CharmingKitten. All of these images are from Crayon or the mini Dolly. These are not ones I came up with myself. These are all AI generated. We're going to start off with Dev0270 or Nemesis Kitten, subcluster of Phosphorus, internet-wide scanning, ransomware extortion. I believe there's a talk about them yesterday, or will be the first day of the conference. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to see that yet. But I'm looking forward to it. So some of the TTPs dumping for LSAS using BitLocker. This was not targeted though. They did hit a children's hospital. They did hit a civilian executive branch agency, a US Police Department, but they're not specific targetedness to their attack. They also use a ton of different vulnerabilities. We don't see a lot of Nemesis Kitten or Dev0270, so we rely on our friends at Microsoft and other places to sort of report on those. One note, throughout the presentation, you'll see QR codes. These QR codes go in our citations to different reporting that I've used. Or blogs that we put out as an easy way for you to see the research that we've referenced. There's a lot of good research out there on CharmingKitten, and we want to make sure that the correct people get the right citations. So the first subcluster of CharmingKitten is what we call spoof scholars. They're spoofing academics with free email addresses, the Outlooks, Gmails, Yahoos, benign conversations. They just want to connect to talk about X, Y, or Z. And then once they do send personalized credential harvest they're personalized and filled to the individual that was sent to them. What's interesting about spoof scholars is that they compromise university-affiliated websites. So websites that may not be directly a university website, but may be related. In this case, we saw it was the SOAS. Their radio station website was compromised. And you can see here, it's very convenient. They say, hey, you can sign in with any of these email providers. Just let us know, sign in, and then you'll see the credit harvest page of gather those credentials. Spoof scholars is a set we track a little bit separately. We see less of actually compromised websites from them because a lot of what we see is actually actor controlled and part of Idealistic Sky. So Idealistic Sky, they are again using benign conversations. They're using actor created email accounts, those Gmails, Outlooks, Hotmail sometimes. A lot of times they will send unsolicited blank emails or draft emails, sort of just try to trick some email security products, or at least attempt to. They do have relatively good English. So most of the time, if you're looking at this, yes, there's going to be grammatical errors, but you're not necessarily going to be able to pick out, yes, that is an Iranian behind the conversation. The English is much better than I think a lot of people would expect. A lot of times they might send a Google Teams like, hey, connect to a Google meeting, but really you're supposed to be a Zoom. And throughout this, we talk about the shifting kill chains. So they are very good at iterating and keep on trying to infect their victims based off of different kill chains. So there's a unofficial BuzzFeed quiz about whether or not you're talking to an Iranian hacker. But when they talk about these benign conversations, what are they talking about? We see a lot of interviews and podcasts, Middle East politics, human rights, new books that they understand if people are coming out with a new book, then they're going to be doing publicity for it. Those sort of things. We do see them focus a lot also on nuclear policy. Obviously, the different nuclear negotiations that are going on with Iran are a big deal. They want to know what the people behind the policy are thinking. And we did see with the conflict in Ukraine versus in Russia, we did see some shift to talking about Eurasia and some Ukraine lures as well. Another big thing that Idealistic Sky does is think tank spoofing. So these are just some of the think tanks that have been spoofed. None of these are specifically victims, but they are spoofed in order to present more realistic kill chains to the targets. What do those kill chains look like? Here's two examples. So on the top one, it begins again with benign conversation. A Dropbox link is sent after sometimes days of conversation to a benign PDF. There's no exploits in the PDF, no malware, just a PDF. But inside that PDF, there's a link to a URL shortener and IP tracker. And then that then leads to an actor controlled domain that harvests the credentials. Another example, after benign conversation, a malicious URL is sent. And in this case, there's two things. One, there's the IP tracker, and then two, there's the phishing page. That phishing page, the metadata from that is sent to a Telegram page, and that's the Ideal Sky Telegram page that CharmingKitten was using. That's the same page that the IP tracker was also sending to. That's sort of the inspiration for the title of this blog. The Ideal Sky Telegram was named by the Iranians themselves. And so what is the Telegram? So due to a misconfiguration within the Telegram, we were able to grab the data and be able to analyze that. So from October 2021 through September of 2022, there are approximately 3,500 entries. Entries were for testing, the accurate testing, IP tracking, redirects, and URL clicks. Targets that we saw, there were 8 think tanks, 2 universities, 6 different foreign governments, and close to 300 personal email accounts. And obviously the goal is to capture those email credentials. I would note that this, even though there's a lot of data here, we believe that this Telegram was just one of the Telegrams used by CharmingKitten and doesn't give a complete picture of what CharmingKitten's been up to. And in fact, when Google reported on Telegram being used by CharmingKitten, they referenced a different Telegram group that had been opened. So this Telegram group was then shut down by Telegram once the Google report came out in September 2022. So the next cluster we see is called false robbery. What we see here is a big thing is the use of compromised accounts. So rather than actor-created accounts, they're using compromised accounts, often with direct links, targeting high-value targets. So for example, one of these, in late 2021, there was a politician who made comments about the negotiations going on with Iran. About 5 days later, their press secretary was targeted via a compromised account by this subset of CharmingKitten. So these are very much reflective of what's going on in the news, and sort of more, we think, high value targets. These aren't not everyone gets to use or it gets targeted by these individuals. So while CharmingKitten, the majority of CharmingKitten does collect information by spear phishing and gathering credentials, we do see malware. So in fall of 2021, we saw this used against diplomatic targets. Both PwC and Checkpoint have both put out great papers on this. It's called, we call it Ghost Echo. Checkpoint calls it Charm Power. Was first used against diplomatic targets, specifically those embassies in Iran. And we by seeing it over time, over a couple of months, we saw active development and then also obfuscation, trying to avoid that SAG detection. Basically, the macro that drops PowerShell that then sends posts to this command and control and then waits for the commands to run. All the modules that came back seem to be espionage focused, and the checkpoint research really goes in depth on what those look like. But gathering information, screenshots, exfiltration of information, that sort of thing. So that's sort of the malware side of CharmingKitten, which is we don't see nearly as often as the spear phishing side of things. So then, most recently, we saw Korg, and Korg was the latest example of remote template injection that we saw following up on the PwC research. So basically here you have multi-persona impersonation that send a OneDrive URL with a phish to a password protected document. They then provide that document within that conversation over email. That document has a remote template injection that downloads Korg and then exfiltrates all that information to the Telegram server. It exfiltrates the list of running processes, the username, the IP information. What was interesting here is that there was no C2 information. There wasn't waiting for a command to come back. There wasn't any sort of bilateral communication. It was just collect information and send it off. Our hypothesis is that there was other exploitation being done. Once you have a list of running processes, you can sort of identify what may be vulnerable to different scanning or different exploits. But we're not sure. This was definitely more targeted than the previous malware, CharmPower, but it's still something that we're not sure what happened here as far as why there was no command and control. And I said multi-persona impersonation, I didn't really define that. So when we talk about multi-persona impersonation, what we're talking about is more than 2 actor-controlled personas on a single thread. TA453 is not the first threat actor to do this. In fact, we actually see it at Proofpoint with some of the more advanced email fraud or business email compromise actors. But what you see here is an example where in order to build the social proof and take advantage of that social proof, one actor control email will email the target and CC another actor. That actor that's CC'd will then be like, yes, I agree, this is a great opportunity, and sort of build the social proof for the initial approach. Sometimes they'll share passwords, sometimes they'll say, hey, I'm so sorry. In one example here, you actually see, so Carol had sent the example of, hey, would you read my article and comment on it? She, in this example, in the screenshot, we do see her providing the password, but in the same conversation, 2 days later, when the individual had not responded, the target, one of the other personas dropped Carol from the email and then said, hey, I am so sorry for Carol's timeliness. Here's the password. Please let us know if you have any questions. So they definitely try to play off the social proof and sort of take advantage of the fact that there's sort of this authority that comes with having one of your peers, often a trusted peer, validate this TA453 persona. So we also see a lot of ad hoc taskings. So it's not just people involved in foreign policy. It's not just people involved in diplomacy. So we do see a lot of, especially starting back in 2021, actually, we saw a lot of targeting of women's and gender studies experts. So prior to all of the revolution and protests going on in Iran, the IRGC clearly cared about women's and gender studies, and specifically those, maybe those that had been talking to them. We also see both Bad Blood, which is one of the first campaigns we published on for this group, but also just recently with the multi-persona impersonation, where they're going after organ regeneration research. So some really advanced medical research that they're interested in. We also see them targeting an engineer at an aerospace company who is involved in space research. Sort of interesting. We don't necessarily know why. We know the IRGC cares about research, or cares about space rather, and is inserting themselves into the Iran space program. So maybe they wanted to have some understanding of what was going on in that space. One of the really interesting ones for us was a Florida-based realtor. And if you look, this is the screenshot we have, where they're saying they want to film some content and look at that. So what's interesting here, though, is that this realtor at the time was actually had multiple sales for homes near US CENTCOM. Obviously, CENTCOM is responsible for the US military presence in the Middle East. So it would make sense that the IRGC would be interested in having some sort of location near that organization. Unfortunately, we blocked this, so we didn't get to see what happened, but they were at least interested. One of the ways specifically for this one that we attributed it was based off of the tracking pixel. So there's a 1x1 tracking pixel in here that links to a site, profilepic.site, that we attributed to TA453 based off some infrastructure overlaps that we've seen previously. And we'll look at a blog that we did later on about some of these ad hoc taskings, and there's some more details in that blog. We've also seen US-based government officials. What's interesting about this is it's not just, hey, here's a random blur for US officials, but it's, hey, here's a veteran study, or hey, hire our heroes. It's very much themed to what you would expect a veteran or a member of the military would be interested in. We also saw same individual that targeted both US-based government officials as well as Middle East oil and gas industry. And that same persona, Samantha, also then started lodging complaints against different European militaries using the same Samantha email. So sort of interesting, you have a persona that is used across programs, if you will. So you have espionage, you have targeting of academics and oil and gas, all by the same persona, which is super interesting. And then as far as the ad hoc taskings in that idealistic sky telegram, there was also a lot of targeting of Iranian travel agencies. This makes sense when you consider that the IRGC has responsibility for keeping track of Iranians coming to and from and traveling to and from Iran. So it makes sense that there would be interest in Iranian travel agencies, and then also foreign embassy personnel. So not just members of the embassy or foreign members of the embassy, but also people who are teaching at the school, the local schools, that sort of thing, were all of interest to CharmingKitten. So they're interested in all these things. What do they do? So Human Rights Watch recently published a great blog, and we identified a couple of different things. One, they do use at times these compromised accounts for their phishing, and we'll see examples of that soon. But they also use Google Takeout to sort of exfiltrate all of the information all at once. And they also synchronize the mailbox to a Microsoft service. So sort of, again, it's sort of the exfiltration of that information for then later processing by the IRGC. One of the ways that we track TA453 is through their infrastructure. We see a couple different pages, different types of pages. We see credential harvesting pages that are actor controlled. We see spoofing pages about different universities or think tanks. We also see URL owners and command and control. There's a lot of good research on different CharmingKitten infrastructure. This is just one example of how this IP, which was hosting CharmingKitten command and control infrastructure, hosts a variety of different domains that also were used for that command and control. So they don't isolate their infrastructure well. We do see the use of unique TLDs like .site, .icu, .info, and .xyz. And that combined with some other unique registration patterns helps us attribute these different types of infrastructure to CharmingKitten. And I know we started with talking about holistic support to IRGC operations. That's one of the exciting things, I think, about this talk. So let's talk about what we see, and you can make your own choice on whether or not CharmingKitten is supporting the IRGC. So in May of 2022, Shin Bet identified the IRGC activity designed to lure Israeli targets abroad to kidnap them. In December of 2021, we see, and this is reflected also in the reporting by Shin Bet, that this domain was given to invite a researcher to observe strategic dialogue. So you have them inviting people to conferences, obviously for dialogue, to then possibly kidnap them. in May of 2022, that we saw an intimidation campaign. So what we saw was one individual targeted by 3 different compromised accounts, some of which were very high value accounts, meaning the individuals were high ranking military intelligence personnel or important NGOs, but 3 different compromised accounts using the same domain to deliver this message of intimidation. This message in Hebrew basically says, we're watching you, every email you get could be from us, we're following you. Basically, it's meant to intimidate the individual. And message, and specifically mentions physical surveillance of watching the individual. So that was super off for us and something that was unique. In that get together quest, which is where the image was hosted on, was shared infrastructure with the previous identified domain by this relation, but about the invitation to the Zurich strategic dialogue. So this is an example of, instead of just phishing or sort of trying to get this individual's credentials, they would just straight up, hey, here's messages, we just want to mess with you, which is unique for TA453 and pretty aggressive as far as espionage related or state aligned phishing campaigns go. So additionally, and on top of all of that, in August of 2022, the DOJ announced indictments against some individuals who were plotting to murder former U.S. officials, including the former national security advisor. So this came out in August. What was interesting is for us, a close affiliate of one of the 2 individuals that was targeted in the plot was also successfully compromised by the core malware in the middle of 2022. So you have a close affiliate of someone who's being plotted, whose murder is being plotted, targeted by CharmingKitten malware. That's super interesting to us. And now, on the other hand, I will say that that same individual was targeted during their time in government with traditional phishing links from the Idealistic Sky Telegram that we talked about. So it's not a straight line to say, yes, this is directly operational supporting IRGC, but it's definitely interesting enough for us to sort of put it out there. As far as attribution goes, so we attribute TA453 to the IRGC-IO, which is the intelligence organization of the IRGC. A couple of different ways we do this. One, on a soft level, the targets that we see reflect what the IRGC has been published as their mandate. Additionally, the U.S. indictments against Monica Witt, who is an Air Force officer who defected to Iran, specifically to call out how she was providing intelligence packets to the IRGC-IO in order to phish them over social media and email. And then lastly, U.S. intelligence against Nemesis Kitten. We do see some indictments against and sanctions against the Nemesis Kitten and different front companies. So closing up, excuse me, CharmingKitten. This is a great overview of what CharmingKitten looks like for us as far as different names for different vendors. Everyone has our own name. We know that T453 pretty much maps to what Mandiant calls AT42. We also know that T453 is a subset of what Microsoft tracks as phosphorus. Nemesis Kitten sort of is a subset of phosphorus as well. APT35, yes, there is some reporting that has APT35 activity that is actually CharmingKitten, but a lot of it's separate. Some of it falls under Tortoiseshell, some of it falls under TA455, which is a different group. And so this is sort of our way of looking at overlap for TF453 and for actors of saying, hey, it's not a one-to-one, there's overlaps. And so we need to talk with industry, talk with friends at different places, sort of understanding what makes the most sense as far as overlapping and sort of showing this is what we see as Proofpoint. We see the phishing side of things, we don't see necessarily the ransomware side of things, and sort of deferring it and illustrating that in a way that makes sense for our customers and consumers. So quick mitigations. The biggest one here, the Emergent Threats Pro rule set. It's really cheap. We put a lot of intel into there. So if you're not an Emergent Threats customer, please consider it. We talked a lot about today. If you have any questions, please reach out. I do want to say thank you to the Proofpoint Threat Insight team, as well as partners, Simeon and Ned at Mystic, as well as Marcus and Tag, CrowdStrike, Mania, PwC, and more. There are a lot of people working on this threat for CharmingKitten, and that collaboration is really important for going against a state-aligned actor like CharmingKitten. So with that, I will end for any questions. And thank you so much for having me. And look forward to chatting with you in the future.